One of the men who once sat across from Johnny Carson would later be prosecuted for murder. Another would face disturbing accusations from within his own family, and another would spiral into a dark chapter of life that ended in tragedy. But on the night they appeared on The Tonight Show, none of that had happened yet. For the audience, these were simply unusual interviews, awkward pauses, strange energy, uncomfortable silences. But Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. For 30 years and more than 22,000 guests, he built his reputation on reading people instantly. He understood timing, body language, tension. He could sense when something in the room shifted. He handled egos. He handled chaos. He handled drunks and divas. But there were 9 guests who genuinely unsettled him, not because they were loud, not because they were difficult, but because something about them felt off, unreadable, volatile, disconnected, or disturbingly still. In subtle ways, Carson leaned back instead of forward. He tightened his smile. He cut interviews short. Backstage, he would quietly admit that something about certain guests had disturbed him. Looking back now, knowing what later happened in some of their lives, those interviews feel different. What did Johnny Carson sense before the rest of the world did? These are the 9 Golden Age guests who made even the most unflappable host uneasy. By the mid-1970s, Truman Capote no longer entered a room, he seemed to drift into it. When he stepped onto The Tonight Show stage in 1975, the applause felt hesitant, almost confused. This was not the sparkling literary provocateur audiences remembered. His frame looked shrunken inside his suit. His movements were delayed, as if his body were responding to commands seconds too late. Even before he spoke, something felt off. Then he began. The voice that had once been theatrical and playful had thinned into something fragile and breathy. Words emerged slowly, sometimes dissolving before they fully formed. He would begin a thought, stop mid-sentence, and let the silence stretch. Not the comfortable pause of a storyteller building suspense, but a hollow, suspended quiet that seemed to swallow the room. Carson waited. The audience waited. No one was sure if Capote had finished speaking or forgotten where he was. At one point, Capote fixed his gaze somewhere just over Carson's shoulder. Not scanning the crowd, not distracted, just staring, unblinking at an empty patch of air. His lips curled into a faint smile, as if reacting to a private joke, whispered from somewhere no one else could hear. Carson instinctively turned his head to follow the line of sight. There was nothing there. Capote then resumed speaking without acknowledging the lapse, launching into fragmented stories about people who had died under strange circumstances, about secrets he claimed to be carrying, about how death lingered around certain individuals like perfume. He giggled softly at moments that did not contain humor. The laughter was small and dry, almost childlike, but it landed wrong, slightly out of sync with the conversation. The band stopped smiling. Crew members later described the atmosphere as temperature drop cold. Carson, who normally leaned forward to engage, slowly shifted backward in his chair. His smile tightened. He glanced at his cue cards more frequently, searching for something solid to anchor the exchange. He attempted a joke. Capote stared at him for a full, unbroken beat, then whispered, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" The audience didn't laugh. Producers made the rare decision to cut to commercial early. During the break, Carson reportedly exhaled and said it felt like interviewing someone who was already halfway gone. What disturbed him wasn't merely impairment. He had handled intoxicated guests before. This was different. Capote did not feel chaotic. He felt absent, as if the body was present, but the center of him had receded somewhere unreachable. Was he watching addiction take hold in real time? Or was it something more unsettling, the visible erosion of a brilliant mind, playing out under studio lights? Years later, as Capote's struggles became public and his decline more evident, that interview would feel less like an awkward television moment and more like a warning no one fully understood at the time. Carson invited him back eventually, but with caution and never with quite the same ease. Because sometimes the most frightening presence isn't rage, it's vacancy. Klaus Kinsky didn't walk onto the Tonight Show stage. He charged into it. From the moment he stepped under the lights in the late 1970s, The energy shifted. Applause broke out, but it felt cautious, almost uncertain. Kinski's presence wasn't theatrical in a charming way. It was volatile. His body appeared coiled, as if every muscle were wound too tight. His eyes wide, unblinking, scanned the room not with curiosity, but with suspicion. He sat down, but he didn't settle. Carson began, as he always did, controlled, polite, easing into conversation. A question about his latest film, a light remark to soften the atmosphere. Kinski didn't respond in rhythm. Instead, he launched into an intense monologue about art, truth, religion, and the decay of modern society. His voice rose and fell unpredictably. At times, it was a low, vibrating growl. At others, it exploded into sharp, cutting emphasis that made even the band flinch. Carson attempted to interject with humor. Kinski stopped mid-sentence and stared at him. Not irritation, not annoyance. A stare that held, unblinking, assessing. The audience audibly shifted in their seats. Crew members later recalled that Carson physically leaned back in his chair, something he rarely did. His shoulders tightened. His hands remained carefully folded in his lap, as if any sudden movement might trigger something. One producer would later say it felt like watching someone sit next to a live wire. The most unsettling moment came when Carson gently tried to redirect the conversation back to the film. Kinski leaned forward abruptly, closing the space between them. His eyes locked onto Carson's with an intensity that felt invasive, almost predatory. He spoke about artistic purity, about hatred for mediocrity, about how most people were spiritually dead. For a brief second, it didn't feel like performance. It felt personal. Security staff reportedly stood just off stage, alert. During the commercial break, producers quietly discussed whether the segment should be ended early. Carson, ever the professional, insisted on finishing it, but he was visibly calculating every word, every pause, every breath. Afterward, he would remark that it was the only time he genuinely wondered whether a guest might become physically violent on air. Was Kinski performing instability? Or was Carson witnessing something that couldn't be switched off once the cameras stopped rolling? Unlike Capote's eerie absence, Kinski radiated presence overwhelming, combustible presence. He didn't feel like someone fading away. He felt like someone about to detonate. And for a man who built his legacy on controlling the room, that loss of psychological footing was deeply unsettling. If Klaus Kinsky felt like imminent explosion, Robert Blake felt like something far more controlled and, in many ways, more disturbing. When Blake appeared on The Tonight Show, he did not bring volatility or theatrical intensity. Instead, he carried a stillness that did not register as calm but as containment, as though every reaction had been measured and pressed flat beneath the surface. Carson opened with warmth, referencing Blake's performances in Cold Blood and Beretta, expecting a professional rhythm of exchange. What he received were clipped, minimal responses delivered in a tone that felt less conversational and more evaluative, as if Blake were weighing each question for motive rather than meaning. The most unsettling element was Blake's gaze. He held eye contact longer than comfort allowed, rarely blinking, rarely softening his expression. It did not feel like engagement. It felt like assessment. Carson tried humor to loosen the atmosphere, but Blake allowed the silence to expand before answering in a flat voice, occasionally edged with a quiet challenge. There was no visible anger to confront, no overt hostility to diffuse, only a deliberate withholding that subtly inverted the power dynamic. As the segment continued, Carson leaned back more than usual and consulted his cue cards with greater frequency, small adjustments that signaled the rhythm had shifted. At one point, Blake reclined slightly and listened with an intensity that made it feel as though the guest were studying the host rather than the other way around. The audience hesitated before laughing. The room did not heat up, it cooled. Years later, that interview would be revisited under far darker circumstances. In 2001, Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley, was shot and killed while sitting in a car outside a restaurant in Los Angeles after the couple had dined together. Blake maintained that he had returned to the restaurant because he had left a firearm inside and that he discovered Bakley had been shot when he came back to the vehicle. In 2002, he was arrested and charged with her murder. The criminal trial concluded in 2005 with Blake being acquitted, the jury finding insufficient evidence to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. However, in a subsequent civil wrongful death lawsuit filed by Bakley's family, a civil jury found Blake liable in 2005 and ordered him to pay millions in damages, a sum later reduced on appeal. For staff members who had witnessed that earlier appearance, the memory of Blake's stillness took on a different tone. What once felt tense began to feel coldly prophetic. Whether he was simply guarded or whether Carson instinctively sensed a deeper darkness remains a matter of interpretation. What is undeniable is that the interview left an imprint. Unlike Capote's fading presence or Kinski's volatility, Blake brought a predator's patience to the couch. And sometimes the most unsettling force in a room is not the loudest voice, but the quiet figure who appears to be studying everything and revealing nothing. Unlike the previous guests, Andy Kaufman did not unsettle Johnny Carson by accident. When he appeared as his alter ego, Tony Clifton, the discomfort was deliberate. That was precisely what made it more disturbing. Carson appreciated Kaufman's strange brilliance when he appeared as himself. There was always an understanding that beneath the awkward silences and surreal bits, Kaufman was in control. But when Tony Clifton took the stage, that line blurred in a way that felt less like performance and more like rupture. Clifton entered not as a guest, but as a disruption. The ill-fitting tuxedo, the greasy wig, the oversized sunglasses, and the heavy cologne created a caricature that seemed aggressively artificial. He did not greet Carson warmly. He barely acknowledged him. Instead, he slouched into the chair with visible contempt, interrupting questions before they were completed, speaking over Carson, dismissing remarks with sneering indifference. The rhythm of the show began to fracture. Carson would attempt to guide the exchange back into structure, but Clifton refused to follow cues. He insulted Ed McMahon. He made crude remarks. He acted as though the entire format of late-night television were beneath him. At first, the audience laughed nervously, assuming this was simply another Kaufman stunt. But the laughter thinned as the tension escalated. There is a specific kind of silence that occurs when viewers are unsure whether they are witnessing comedy or confrontation. That silence settled heavily over the studio. Carson's posture shifted. He remained professional, but there was a visible tightening around his eyes. He attempted humor. Clifton responded with hostility. He attempted structure. Clifton shattered it again. The exchange no longer felt like a controlled comedic experiment. It felt like an intrusion. The breaking point came when Clifton, irritated with the band's accompaniment to his intentionally terrible singing, hurled a glass of water toward musical director Doc Severinsen. It was not a theatrical gesture for applause. It was abrupt and jarring. Carson stood up and walked off the set, an extremely rare move that signaled something had crossed from uncomfortable into unacceptable. While cameras cut and producers scrambled, Clifton continued shouting obscenities, refusing to leave the stage. Security eventually intervened to remove him physically. What made the incident so unsettling was not simply the chaos, but the refusal to break character. Even as the situation deteriorated, Kaufman never returned to himself. There was no wink to the audience, no acknowledgement that this was satire. It created a psychological distortion. If the act never ends, does it stop being an act? Carson later allowed Kaufman back as himself, but permanently banned the Tony Clifton persona. He could handle difficult, he could handle bizarre, but he drew the line at something that felt like reality dissolving in real time. Was Clifton merely performance art pushed to its limit? Or did Carson sense the unnerving power of someone who could erase the boundary between fiction and behavior so completely that the room no longer felt safe? Sometimes what disturbs isn't anger. It's someone who refuses to admit they're pretending. George Jessel walked onto the Tonight Show stage like a relic from another century. In his 70s at the time, he carried himself with the confidence of early vaudeville, a booming voice, exaggerated gestures, and the absolute certainty that he knew how to command a room. Carson introduced him respectfully, framing him as a veteran entertainer with decades of stories to share. What followed, however, was not nostalgic charm, but something far more unsettling. At first, it seemed harmless, an old-timer warming up the audience. Then Jessel began slipping into jokes built around exaggerated ethnic accents and racial stereotypes that had long since fallen out of favor. He mimicked voices. He described entire communities through caricature. He laughed loudly at his own punchlines. The audience did not laugh with him. Instead, a strange stillness spread across the studio. Not confusion, not mistiming, something closer to shock. When the silence lingered, Jessel reportedly looked out at the crowd and commented that people today are too sensitive, doubling down rather than recalibrating. Carson attempted to pivot, gently steering the conversation toward Jessel's film career and early Hollywood anecdotes. But Jessel returned to stories from the old days, repeating language that by the 1970s was already considered deeply offensive for national television. Each sentence seemed to drag the room further backward in time. The discomfort was not explosive, it was suffocating. Camera operators later described the atmosphere as airless, as if everyone present was waiting for someone to pull an emergency brake. Carson's smile tightened. He glanced at his cue cards more often than usual. His laugh became thinner, measured, strategic. He was calculating not how to win a joke, but how to exit the situation without igniting an on-air confrontation with an elderly guest who seemed completely unaware of the damage he was doing. What made the segment genuinely creepy was not simply the outdated material. It was Jessel's total disconnection from the present. He did not register the silence as rejection. He interpreted it as audience failure. The cultural shift that had taken place over decades, civil rights movements, changing broadcast standards, evolving public consciousness, appeared invisible to him. He spoke as though the world had paused in 1925 and everyone else had moved without permission. At one point, after another joke landed in total silence, Carson made the rare decision to cut to commercial earlier than scheduled. When the show returned, Jessel was gone from the couch, replaced by the next guest. The transition was abrupt but necessary. Backstage, Carson reportedly remarked that this show is not about that, making clear that what had just aired did not represent the direction he wanted the program to take. He was not rattled in the way he had been by volatile or psychologically unstable guests. He was disturbed in a different way. Jessel had not been hostile. He had not been intoxicated. He had not been unpredictable. He had simply been out of time and unaware of it. And sometimes what unsettles a room is not aggression or chaos, but the sudden realization that the past can resurface without warning, speak loudly, and refuse to acknowledge that the world has changed. Divine did not walk onto The Tonight Show as a guest. Divine walked on as a confrontation. The towering beehive wig, the razor-sharp arched brows painted high above the eyes, the heavy sculpted makeup and unapologetic posture made it immediately clear that this was not going to be a routine late-night exchange. Carson, who prided himself on maintaining control of tone and rhythm, suddenly found himself interviewing someone who had no interest in fitting inside the expected frame. When Carson opened with polite questions about John Waters' films and Divine's rising fame, Divine responded calmly but with an undercurrent that unsettled the room. At one point, Divine suggested, in essence, that if audiences felt shocked, it was because they were afraid of seeing what they actually are. The line was delivered evenly, almost softly. There was no shouting, no theatrics. Yet it landed like an accusation aimed not just at society, but at the people sitting in the studio. Carson attempted to lighten the mood, joking about whether Divine enjoyed making people uncomfortable. Divine tilted their heads slightly, fixed Carson with steady eye contact, and replied that discomfort was revealing. "I don't scare people," Divine implied. "I just hold up a mirror." It was that phrasing the mirror that created a strange shift in power. Divine was not positioning themselves as the spectacle. Divine was suggesting the audience was the spectacle. As the conversation continued, Divine leaned further into the idea that gender was performance, stating that gender is just another costume and costumes are meant to be changed. In the 1970s, on a mainstream network stage, that was not a casual remark. It challenged assumptions many viewers had never been asked to question. Divine did not soften the statement or wrap it in humor. It was delivered as fact, not argument. That certainty was what made it unsettling. At another moment, when referencing critics who had labeled Divine a freak or monster, Divine reportedly said something to the effect of, "People call something a monster when they don't want to admit they're fascinated by it." The room did not laugh. A few nervous chuckles surfaced, but they dissolved quickly. Carson's smile tightened, not in hostility, but in recalibration. The rhythm he relied on, the easy back and forth, was slipping. Divine wasn't attacking him, but the energy in the exchange suggested something larger was being challenged. The most unsettling aspect was Divine's composure. There was no aggression, no raised voice, just deliberate confidence and a refusal to dilute meaning for comfort. Divine seemed aware of the tension and, rather than diffusing it, allowed it to sit in the room. That willingness to let discomfort breathe felt almost predatory, not in threat, but in psychological dominance. The audience shifted in their seats. Carson leaned back slightly more than usual. Laughter came slower. After the segment, Carson reportedly referred to the appearance as different, a carefully chosen understatement. Crew members later recalled that he had not been offended or angry. He had been displaced. Divine had altered the center of gravity in the room not through chaos, but through clarity. Divine did not shout. Divine did not provoke with vulgarity. Divine simply said things that forced the audience to question their own boundaries. And sometimes the creepiest presence in a room is not the loudest one. It's the person who looks at you calmly and suggests that you are the one wearing the costume. Unlike the others on this list, Vincent Price was not hostile, unstable, or culturally disruptive. He was charming, articulate, and often one of Carson's favorite guests. But there were moments, small, precise moments, when Price's presence shifted from theatrical to something more unsettling, and even Johnny Carson, master of composure, visibly recoiled. Price had a way of speaking that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. During one appearance, when asked about his love of Edgar Allan Poe, he began reciting a passage in a voice barely above a whisper. The studio lights were dimmed slightly for atmosphere. His tone dropped into that signature velvet baritone, and he elongated certain words, midnight, shadow, nevermore, until they seemed to linger in the air. What made it unsettling was not volume, but control. He didn't rush. He didn't exaggerate. He let silence do the work. At one point, Price paused mid-recitation and slowly turned his head toward Carson without breaking eye contact. He smiled faintly, not warmly, but knowingly, and continued the line as if it were directed solely at him. Carson laughed, but it was a quick, reflexive laugh, the kind meant to break tension. It didn't fully land. During another appearance, Price discussed horror in a way that blurred performance and personal philosophy. He remarked, almost casually, that fear was a doorway, and that the most interesting thing about terror was watching how quickly civility evaporates when the lights go out. He wasn't threatening. He was analyzing. But the phrasing made the audience shift in their seats. It sounded less like film commentary and more like observation. Carson once joked that Price could make even a recipe for chicken sound like a eulogy. And there was truth in that. When Price described cooking, he would lean in slightly and say things like, "You must let the flavors surrender, slowly." The word surrender, spoken in that voice, drew uneasy laughter. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Every word carried weight, as if it were part of a spell rather than a sentence. One of the most unsettling moments reportedly occurred when Price brought a small taxidermy bat as a gift. Holding it delicately, he remarked with a faint smile that creatures of the night are often misunderstood. Then, after a pause just long enough to stretch the silence, he added, "They're not evil, they're simply patient." Carson handled the gift politely, but his shoulders visibly tightened. The audience laughed, but softly. Price also enjoyed breaking proximity boundaries in subtle ways. During a particularly dramatic retelling of a horror scene, he reached out and lightly grasped Carson's wrist while whispering a line about something breathing just behind you. Carson physically jumped. The audience roared, but the initial reaction was genuine startle, not staged comedy. What made Vincent Price creepy wasn't unpredictability. It was precision. He knew exactly how far to lean into the macabre before pulling back. He understood tension as a tool. He would lower his voice at just the right moment, hold eye contact a second too long, then smile as if he'd shared a private joke with the dark itself. After one especially theatrical segment, Carson reportedly said off-camera that for a moment he had forgotten we were on television. That was the key. Price had the ability to dissolve the safe distance between fiction and reality. The stage stopped feeling like a stage. The performance stopped feeling like performance. Unlike Kinski's volatility or Blake's cold stare, Price's unsettling quality was intentional and artful. Carson respected him deeply, but there were flickers, visible flickers, when Johnny's composure cracked just enough to reveal something authentic, a brief, involuntary chill. And perhaps that was Price's greatest trick, to make even the most unflappable host wonder just for a second whether the darkness he was describing was entirely imaginary. Margot Hemingway walked onto the Tonight Show stage looking exactly the way America expected her to look: tall, luminous, perfectly styled, every inch the supermodel whose face had once sold perfume and fantasy. But within the first few exchanges, something felt misaligned. Not scandalous, not chaotic, just off. Carson opened with the usual warmth, asking about her latest film and the whirlwind of modeling success that had made her a household name. Margot smiled, nodded, and answered, but her responses carried a faint delay, as though each sentence had to travel through fog before reaching the surface. At one point, she began describing her recent work, then abruptly stopped mid-thought. Not for emphasis, not for laughter. She simply stopped. Her eyes drifted slightly upward, unfocused, as if she were trying to remember where she was. The silence stretched long enough to make the audience shift. Carson gave a soft chuckle to ease the tension. Margot blinked, smiled again, and resumed her sentence as if nothing had happened. The dissonance was subtle, but it accumulated. When Carson asked about carrying the Hemingway name, Margot responded with a line that unsettled the room. She said it felt like living with a shadow that never leaves the room. She smiled while saying it, but her tone did not match the expression. Then she added, almost casually, that sometimes it was hard to tell whether people saw her or just the name. The audience didn't laugh. They listened. Later in the interview, Carson gently asked whether she felt fulfilled by her success. Margot leaned slightly back and said, "Success is loud. Emptiness is quiet." The sentence hung in the air longer than expected. Carson attempted a light follow-up, but Margot continued, elaborating that sometimes she woke up unsure of what city she was in or why she felt like a guest in her own life. That phrasing, "a guest in her own life," shifted the mood entirely. It wasn't promotional. It wasn't witty. It sounded like confession. At one point, Carson asked directly, "Are you happy?" Margot paused, held eye contact longer than social instinct normally allows, and replied, "Happiness is something people perform very well." The audience responded with a few uncertain laughs. Carson's smile tightened. It was the kind of answer that didn't fit into a talk show box. As the segment progressed, her sentences grew more fragmented. She occasionally answered questions Carson hadn't asked yet, as if hearing something slightly out of sync. She described feeling watched, not by people, but by expectation. "It's like there's always something behind you," she said at one point, glancing briefly over her shoulder before laughing it off. The laugh was light, but the glance felt real. What made the interview deeply unsettling wasn't volatility or anger. It was fragility that kept flickering through the polished exterior. There was a visible effort to remain composed, to deliver the right smile at the right time. But in between those practiced beats, something vulnerable and unanchored surfaced. After the show, Carson reportedly remarked that she wasn't difficult. She seemed troubled, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, in a quiet way, a way that lingered. Years later, when her life entered darker chapters and eventually ended under tragic circumstances, several crew members remembered that interview not as awkward television, but as a moment when something was visible in plain sight, Not chaos, not scandal, just a woman smiling under bright lights while saying things that sounded like she was already drifting somewhere else. And sometimes the creepiest thing you can hear on live television is not a threat. It's someone calmly describing their own emptiness. Andy Warhol did not create discomfort through aggression, provocation, or instability. He created it through absence. When Warhol appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson was prepared for eccentricity. What he encountered instead was something closer to emotional blankness. From the moment Warhol sat down, he seemed physically present but psychologically distant, as if observing the show from somewhere just slightly outside of it. Carson opened with thoughtful questions about pop art, celebrity culture, and the factory. Warhol responded with single words: yes, no, maybe. Occasionally, he added a flat, I don't know. The tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't irritated, it was neutral to the point of erasure. Carson smiled, waited for elaboration. None came. At one point, Carson asked what inspired Warhol's fascination with fame. Warhol stared forward for several seconds before replying, I think everybody should be famous. He paused, then added softly, for a little while. The audience laughed lightly, expecting irony. Warhol did not smile. He did not wink. He did not signal whether it was a joke. The laugh faded awkwardly. Carson tried humor, remarking that Warhol might be the quietest man he had ever interviewed. Warhol shrugged and said, talking is overrated. The delivery was so flat it felt less like wit and more like diagnosis. Carson attempted follow-up questions about Warhol's films, his art process, his social circle. The answers remained minimal. It's interesting. It's nice. People like it. Each phrase felt like a door gently closing. What made the moment creepy wasn't silence alone, it was Warhol's gaze. He didn't stare intensely like Blake. He didn't blink wildly like Kinski. He looked through Carson. His eyes were open, attentive, but detached, as though the conversation were happening in another room. A camera operator later described it as interviewing someone made of glass. At one moment, Carson directly asked, half-jokingly, do you even want to be here? Warhol tilted his head slightly and said, I'm here. Not yes, not no. Just a statement of physical presence. The audience laughed nervously. Carson leaned back, clearly recalibrating. There were stretches where Carson spoke longer than Warhol did, filling the vacuum with his own commentary to prevent the segment from collapsing entirely. The rhythm of the show, normally quick, warm, reactive, became elongated, suspended. Every pause felt heavier than it should. Near the end of the interview, Warhol said something that lingered. When discussing celebrity, he remarked that people are more interesting when you don't know what they're thinking. He said it casually, but paired with his refusal to reveal anything of himself, it sounded less like philosophy and more like a deliberate strategy. After the segment, Carson reportedly joked off-air that Warhol could have been a wax figure, but crew members noted that he seemed unsettled, not irritated, but disturbed in a deeper way. Warhol had not attacked him, embarrassed him, or broken the rules of decorum. He had simply refused to participate in the human exchange that late-night television depends on. There is something profoundly eerie about a person who gives you nothing to react to. No warmth, no hostility, no visible insecurity, just presence without access. And for a host whose career was built on connection, rapport, and timing, Andy Warhol represented the most unsettling possibility of all. A conversation without a person inside it. The discomfort wasn't always loud or chaotic. Sometimes it was a stare that lingered just a second too long, a joke that carried something colder beneath its surface, or a silence that refused to be filled. Sometimes it was a smile that didn't match the eyes, or a presence that felt strangely detached from the room itself. Carson never exploded, never humiliated his guests, never allowed the stage to descend into open disorder. Yet, if you watch closely, you can see the micro-reactions, the tightened jaw, the subtle lean backward instead of forward, the laugh arriving half a beat too late, the commercial break called slightly earlier than planned. The real question isn't whether these guests were eccentric, controversial, or misunderstood. The question is whether Carson sensed something before headlines confirmed it, before public narratives formed, before hindsight reshaped those appearances into warning signs. Was it intuition? Experience? Or simply the raw honesty of live television, where masks sometimes slip under the pressure of bright lights? If you've enjoyed exploring these rare moments when even Johnny Carson seemed unsettled in his own studio, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden tension behind iconic television history. Because sometimes, the most revealing truths aren't found in the applause or the punchlines, they're hidden in the pauses.